Hello and welcome everyone to today's 30-minute conversation on matching the coachee with a coach. Got some great stuff to cover and a fast 30 minutes to do it. First off, I do want to say so great to see so many familiar faces and also to see some new names and faces here. So welcome everyone. For those of you that are unfamiliar with it, each time we do one of these, we do record it and it will be loaded on our YouTube channel, so you'll have access to the information again afterwards. And for everyone who registered, you will receive an email with a link to that recording. Several of you submitted questions ahead of time. We'll make sure we're getting those addressed as we go through. Plus, I want to invite you to ask more questions. I love it when you ask questions. So two ways you can do it. One is you can type it into the question panel, and I will monitor that as we go. The other way that you can do it is if you want to raise your hand and come on live, I can unmute you individually. You can ask your question live. So let's get those questions answered for you. First off, what is our agenda for this conversation? We're going to talk about the setup for the coaching. We'll discuss coaching qualifications or coach qualifications, Coachee Interests, the process. We'll discuss compatibility, and then of course provide resources and take additional questions at the end. So let's dive into the setup part. First off is a really good understanding of coaching. Some of you work in the corporate setting, and what we find is that there is still a lack of understanding about coaching. Oftentimes it is equated to mentoring, training, HR, or consulting functions, and it's actually a very different role. So to get the best out of a coaching relationship, you want everyone to have a clear understanding of exactly what coaching is. The definition from the International Coach Federation, I'm guessing many, if not all of you are familiar with this, is partnering with clients. And I love that they put that word in there, because then when you have the conversation with people, you can explain it. And partnering is very, very different than coming in as, hey, I'm the expert and the one who's going to tell you what to do, because it truly is that partnership. And thought-provoking and creative process that's so fun inspires them to maximize their personal and professional potential. So being clear on the front end of what it is. Now let's dive into coach qualifications. When you choose a coach, what's important? How do you decide? So first off, yes, you want a coach who's been trained, who's certified. It's interesting to me how often people say, oh, well, we don't need to get trained in that. And it's just amazing. So go back to what we've all said many times. If you're going to hire an accountant or a financial planner, are you going to hire somebody with no training? Are you going to hire anybody in any capacity if they do not have the skill set for it? So coach specific training, which is very different than other kinds. Occasionally we'll have somebody say, okay, what about a mental health professional? Maybe they're a psychologist or a psychiatrist. They'll make a great coach. Chances are they will make a great coach after they're trained to be a coach, because it's a very different role. Much like if you have a doctor that you love, you're not going to go to them to get a crown or a cavity filled in your mouth, because they're a medical doctor, which is very different than a dentist. All right, so training and certification. And of course, the process of training and certification is to develop the coaching competencies. And we are going to go through those because the review is so essential for coach qualifications. Having that code of ethics in place, and what that generally means is you want a coach who is a member of the International Coach Federation, because bottom line, if they are not a member of the International Coach Federation, there's no accountability to a code of ethics. Once they join the ICF, the International Coach Federation, they're accountable to that code of ethics. That's an important piece to know and be aware of. You also want a coach who is coached. Think about it this way. If they believe in what they're doing, they're going to access that resource for themselves. And you want a coach who has a process. They have a specific formula, and You also want a coach who is able to flex and step outside of that process. I'll give you an example. Oftentimes we'll see a coach that says, okay, every client I work with gets this assessment before we start. Okay, process is great, applying it uniformly regardless of the circumstances is not. So it's a process and a willingness to flex and adjust that process based on circumstances. Now, the competencies are qualifications, a coach that has developed these skill sets. The International Coach Federation has 11 competencies. They've got them in 4 categories. The first category is setting the foundation. And within that, the competencies are meeting the ethical guidelines and professional standards and establishing the coaching agreement. So when you're selecting a coach, and actually one of the questions ahead of time was, okay, so if we're a company hiring a coach for an individual, how do we decide on that? Number one thing I'm going to say is be looking at coaches who understand the difference between a sponsor and a client. The sponsor is the company, the organization paying for the coaching. The client is the individual who's being coached. The agreements that they establish in both cases are different. There's one type of an agreement with an organization, a different type of agreement with the actual client. Next in competencies is co-creating the relationship. These competencies include establishing trust and intimacy with the client and coaching presence. I want to hit on that number 3, trust and intimacy. The number one indicator of success in a coaching relationship is the rapport between the coach and the client. That is more important than anything else in terms of it being effective and successful. Coaching presence is a skill of really being there in the moment, understanding the client and flexing with them. Communicating effectively simply makes sense. I know that when you think about it, you go, yeah, well, duh, of course. There are 3 competencies here: active listening, powerful questioning, and direct communication. Now, what's interesting is that these skills are different in coaching than they are in different professional capacities. So that goes back to, you do want a coach who's a member of the ICF. In many cases, we're seeing organizations wanting a coach who's credentialed, has one of the credentials with the ICF. Our 4th category of competencies is facilitating learning and results. And the competencies here include creating awareness. And creating awareness is really about the coach challenging and expanding the thinking of the individual. Designing actions, planning and goal setting. This is being very intentional, both in how they're working together in that relationship and in the client deciding what they're going to do and how they're doing it, moving forward towards specific measurable goals. And then, of course, managing progress and accountability. So when you look at the competencies, great insight, great information, makes sense that we want a coach who's developed these for the application specifically in that coaching relationship. All right. When Harvard Business Review did a survey and say, okay, when you hire a coach, what are the most important factors? And 2 things came out of that. One is experience in a similar setting. Now that's something somebody's going to have based on what their background is. And the other is a specific process. So it's important to know that the coach really does have a way of approaching this and going through it. So one of the things we've done, for example, at the Center for Coaching Certification, is we have a model that describes the relationship, and then we have a specific process that we work through. So the model we call the staircase to success. The foundation of that staircase is the training, the competency, and the ethics of the coach. The relationship is built on that foundation, hence stairs on that framework. The first piece, as we saw already, is that agreement between the coach and the client. Then back to developing that trust and intimacy and presence, the coach really understanding the client, who they are, how they think, process, and function. That in and of itself is a skill. Coaches having that ability is essential in choosing the right coach. Next, you have rapport. Rapport is about a coach who really connects with the client, develops that trust and intimacy, and it is built on everything that comes before and back to number one indicator of success. That trust and intimacy, that rapport, opens up what happens in the communication process, which in turn supports the exploration process for the client, and from their development of a strategy, moving them to their doorway with the success being defined by them. Coaching process as an example. An introductory session. Now, this is going to be huge in matching the coach and the client, and we'll talk about it more later. I'm going to give you the first piece on it right now. The bottom line is when the client is involved in selecting the coach, you're going to have the greatest level of success. An introductory coaching session is designed for exactly that. It is an opportunity for that individual client to get to know the coach and the process so that they are involved in saying, yeah, I want to move forward. An opening session is a big picture exploration. It's very important when you're selecting a coach. Think about it this way. If they come in and they only know part of what's going on, hey, we're only going to talk about the job, and the coach is strictly limited to that, they're going to be unaware of influencing factors and competing priorities that the client is dealing with. So you also want to know that you have a coach who is going to take the time to understand the client's big picture and be aware of those competing priorities, different factors. It makes a huge difference in the success of that relationship. And then, of course, a coach who knows how to work with that client on their focus and level of engagement in the process. An ongoing coaching relationship, the client is prioritizing what they want to work on, strategizing, defining their action plan, and then checking in with the coach, acknowledging progress and success along the way, and being accountable to their follow-through. You also want to anticipate at some point that relationship will be complete. When you're choosing a coach, are they aware of, gee, how are we setting this client up for the long term? And then also planning ahead for that closing conversation where the client is evaluating what they've gained, talking about how they're implementing that learning moving forward. Very significant. Okay, so coach qualifications are the training, the certification, and where appropriate, a credential. It's also about their experience, and that's something that comes over time. Now, what's interesting is with training, certification, and a credential, you will find that even people that are fairly new to coaching have a background and experience that supports them being highly effective very quickly. Okay. Let's get some backup for some of these things we're throwing out to you. For example, and this is really interesting, when they did a survey, 59% of the leaders want an external coach, 12% preferred internal, 29% had no preferences. There's some reasons behind that. Leaders often consider the internal coaches to be less confidential. They're aware of the training difference between an internal and an external coach. When you have an external coach, the thought is, okay, they're bringing in greater objectivity, fresher perspectives, higher levels of confidentiality, experience in many different organizations and industries and businesses. And that's all perceived as beneficial by those leaders. More on this. Okay, working with an external coach is significantly related to a successful coaching experience, regardless of the coachee's level in the organization. So there's that preference for an outside coach. At the same time, internal coaching makes a lot of sense for organizations. Bottom line, it's very cost effective, and there's some value and benefit to that. Internal coaches are aware of the culture and some of the dynamics inside the organization as well. So here's what we're finding. Internal coaches for entry level to mid-level inside the organization. External coaches for the highest levels of management. it makes sense. Now, a caveat to this, very often organizations are doing internal training, and at the same time, external training is most strongly correlated with overall coaching success. So when you're choosing a coach, you want to be looking at where they got their training, because that's a big part of that success. Degree of subject matter expertise. Pros and cons on this one. When a coach has subject matter expertise, on the pro side, they're very quickly up to speed with the client. They understand and get what that client is talking about. On the con side, sometimes it gets in the way because the coach, quote unquote, knows the answer when ultimately the answer's got to come from the client. So having enough expertise to understand the client, what they're dealing with, without it being so much that the coach becomes the expert. And this is going to apply whether it's an internal or an external coach. You've got to be making a decision on which route you want to go when you're choosing a coach. Next in your consideration is the interest of the individual client who's going to be coached. We talk about coachability there as well. So first off, them having specific goals. Now, sometimes that comes from, hey, a manager saying you've got to work on these areas. Sometimes it's their own desire to advance what they're doing. Ultimately, if the client owns those goals, that's where you're going to have the greatest level of success. And it's a huge factor. Sometimes those goals are going to be business related, sometimes they're career related, and sometimes it's more about balance. It's on a personal side. You want a client who really cares about figuring out their strategies, about expanding their awareness in terms of what's going on, that they care about the coaching and they fully engage with it. Now, in coaching, there's two different approaches, and some of you who have taken the training are familiar with this. There's the specific purpose versus the whole person. It used to be we stuck with that specific focus. In the corporate setting, we said, okay, this is about the job and about work, and that's all we're going to talk about and do. And increasingly, we're finding it is most effective when the coach is comfortable being uncomfortable and working with the whole person, because it is the whole person who ultimately is going to create change and achieve goals. Now, sometimes a coachee is aware of the difference and sometimes they are not. Sometimes they are aware of the impact and sometimes they are not. So just asking, hey, which approach do you want, isn't going to cut it. You've got to take the time to have the conversation. Here's what this means, here's what that means, here are the pros and the cons of each approach, because ultimately when they choose, they have ownership of the coaching process. It's going to increase the success level, and you're going to find that as much as we think, oh, well, they're going to want the specific purpose, more often than not, they're choosing the whole person approach. Be open to working with them as a whole person. All right, next on our list, coachee interests. We want them buying in to the coaching. We want them to be coachable, which means open to new awareness, new learning, different actions, creating change. And we want them to really be involved in terms of what this coaching is all about, what it means, how it works. So a clear understanding in terms of the coaching relationship, and then for the coach to understand what the client understands and their expectations. Now, as far as compatibility in this coaching relationship, when a client has confidence in the coaching relationship, when the communication is effective, and when you develop the rapport and trust, that's how you gain that compatibility in the relationship. This is going to go back to that question that we talked about earlier. If someone else is picking the coach for an individual, I'm going to match personalities and all that kind of thing, that's maybe helpful and maybe harmful. There are often times when a different personality in a coach is going to balance what's going on with the client. It is more important that the client be comfortable with that coach. and be confident in that relationship. So get the client involved in choosing their coach. Compatibility is more about how are you going to effectively support that. So one of the barriers that some of you face inside of an organization is you have a leader that says, go find me a coach. And you're going, well, you're going to want to interview them. And they're going, I don't have time for that. So how are you going to approach that? Sometimes what happens is the person in the organization directed to hire a coach, collects a couple of bios, does a couple of interviews, narrows it down, and then you go to that leader who's going to be coached, you provide their bios, you recommend, they contact the one that is maybe their top choice, talk to them. If they're not comfortable, they can go to their next choice. You want that leader involved in choosing their coach. I recommend they interview at least 3, and an introductory session is a great way to do that. It's an initial 20 to 30-minute coaching session. The leader will gain value whether or not that's the coach they choose, and they're going to be involved in choosing their coach. All right, major finding. This comes straight out of the research. Having an interview with the prospective coach has the strongest relationship with reporting a successful coaching program. It makes a difference. So we're getting a couple of common themes here. Matching the right coach with the right client is associated with higher success rates. Matching people according to expertise and personality seem to be both the best and most commonly used strategies. So that's your starting point, and ultimately getting the client involved, because then you're going to have an opportunity for developing the rapport and tapping that expertise and choosing what level of subject matter expertise is going to best serve them. Compatibility, the foundation of it, is the coach training and expertise. Goes back to what we discussed earlier. That initial session or interview, again, you're laying the foundation for compatibility between the coach and the client. And then, of course, the coach having the ethics in place, the agreement in place, addressing roles and confidentiality, because that's how you're going to develop the trust and intimacy. Over time, the presence of the coach to the client, being in the moment, flexing their communication skills and their effectiveness in truly empowering the client, that's what's going to move you towards success in that relationship. So awesome in terms of it all works together. That's your process. Now, organizations that are resources for you, of course, the International Coach Federation, the Center for Coaching Certification, Center for Coaching Solutions, among many. The International Coach Federation is at coachfederation.org. The Center for Coaching Certification is at coachcert.com. That's updated, fresh look on that website. Center for Coaching Solutions at centerforcoachingsolutions.com. Another resource for you. So articles and publications. We do have a blog with new posts every week. We have a series of books, and what I love about these is every chapter in every book is a totally separate and individual read written by one of the graduates of the program, and you're going to get a lot of great insight and information out of these. And then, of course, these free webinars that we do every month. We do want to be available to you, so if you want a quick phone call or you want to send an email with some questions, we are here to respond to that and to support you in what you're doing. We are also available to you for outsourcing support for developing, evaluating, managing a coaching program. We also provide training, whether you want to attend some of our publicly available programs or you want it inside your organization. And then, of course, we do have coaches. With so many graduates, we've actually got a full business development side where we will work with you and provide coaches when you want external coaches. Next steps for you at this point, well, of course, many of you are familiar with this. Back to wanting to be available for you, we do offer a free 30 minutes. So when I send you a link to the recording of today's program, if you want that to take advantage of that free 30 minutes, simply send me an email. I'll send you a link to my calendar. You can pick a time and make it happen. Next for you is going to be choosing your resources. What are you going to be using? Planning your process. How specifically are you going to move yourself forward? And then implementing your strategy so that you do achieve your results. I want to take a few minutes now to open it up to your questions. So I'm going to ask you to do questions in one of two ways. One is type them into the control panel, and the other is, if whoever's brave enough, raise your hand. I will unmute you and you can come on live, and love doing that. So if anybody's ready for that, go ahead. And let's see. So I'm seeing your comments. I'm glad this is helpful to you. That's really good. And I'm glad this is reinforcing what you're doing as far as those steps. And I am seeing, it looks like we've answered the questions you had thus far. And at this point, I'm going, okay, I think I've covered what you were asking me and looking for another question. And other than that, we may be complete. So great. Thank you for your things. Glad it was helpful. I've got several of you commenting on that. Lots of good input there. So glad it's helpful. You all as well have a fabulous weekend. Definitely excited about it being Friday, I'm sure. So I do want to say thank you to each and every one of you. Appreciate your time and your participation today. Do let us know how we can be helpful for you in the future. So thank you, everyone.